the Ford Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Land Portal Foundation. 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases are zoonoses, meaning they can be transmitted from animals to humans, with Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19 being examples. Scientists are warning that deforestation, industrial agriculture, illegal wildlife trade, climate change, and other types of environmental degradation increase the risk of future pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic poses a grave health threat to Indigenous peoples around the world. Indigenous communities already experience poor access to healthcare, significantly higher rates of communicable diseases, and lack of access to essential services like sanitation. Local medical facilities are often under-equipped and understaffed. Even when Indigenous peoples are able to access healthcare services, they can face stigma and discrimination. This webinar will discuss the connection between land rights, climate, and the health of Indigenous peoples, based on evidence that the damage caused to the planet will bring more zootropic diseases. Officials from the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the World Wildlife Fund International have directly linked the emergence of pandemics like coronavirus to our broken relationship with nature, epitomized by the destruction of natural habitats and the collapse of biodiversity. They call for a shift back to ecological and ecosystem integrity, sustainable coexistence with the natural world, values which have underpinned Indigenous values for centuries, making Indigenous people key actors in the battle to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I'm going to start today by introducing myself as well as the panelists. We'll then discuss 3 different questions for about an hour, and we'll end with 30 minutes for your questions. A few additional logical notes about the webinar before beginning. Logistical notes. Please note that live tweeting is occurring for this event from the Land Portal Twitter account, and the hashtag we're using is hashtag IPLC COVID-19. If you do have questions, please post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box feature, and we'll answer them during the final half hour. You can be putting those in throughout the webinar as you come up with ideas. My name's Lori Gehring. I edit the Thomson Reuters Foundation's news website on the human impacts of climate change. Previously, I was a Chicago Tribune correspondent based in New Delhi, Johannesburg, Mexico City, Havana, Rio de Janeiro, and London. Joshua Lichtenstein is with us today, has been a rights and environmental activist for almost 30 years, working with the community, Indigenous, women, farmer, and conservation grassroots organizations and NGOs in both the US and internationally. He spent a decade in Latin America as a trainer accompanying social movement advocacy campaigns, working with Indigenous communities managing forests and coastal marine ecosystems and fighting extractive industries. Most recently, he spent 6 years as Latin America and Forest Program Manager, and then as campaign director at the DC-based Bank Information Center, where he was also one of the CSO observers to the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility for 4 of those years. He's currently working with RFUS on the Panama and Guyana programs. Celia Chacriaba is an Indigenous educator and activist, the Chacriaba people of Brazil. She's best known for holding debates and lectures at universities in Brazil, promoting, among other things, advancement of the status and rights of Indigenous women, Indigenous land rights, and Indigenous education. And Mina Susana Setra is an Indigenous environmental and land rights activist from Borneo. She serves as an activist for the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago and was instrumental in securing a ruling from the Constitutional Court recognizing customary land rights of Indigenous people. So we'll get going with questions. First one to Josh. What do you see as the links between land rights, the coronavirus pandemic, and Indigenous health? And can you tell us a bit more about the Amazon Emergency Fund?
Thanks, Lori, and good morning, everyone. The Amazon Emergency Fund sprung up as a new initiative just this past April. It's a collaboration between COICA, which is the Coordination of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin, the largest representative Indigenous organization across the 9 countries of the Amazon, and a large group of NGOs and donor allies also working in the Amazon in the face of the enormous threats posed by the spread of COVID-19 through the region. The aim of the fund is to get resources, food, medicine, personal protective equipment, funding to Indigenous territories as quickly and as directly as possible, working within existing networks and trying to build synergy between all of our efforts. So far, we've raised about $2.5 million from the organization members of our founding circle and thousands of individuals online, and a generous donation from the French government. You can learn more about the emergency fund at amazonemergencyfund.org. And I'd have to say, land rights has really been fundamental to the pandemic response of Indigenous communities in the Amazon basin. The first set of actions that many territories were implementing were directed to trying to close off territories from outsiders who might bring in the virus. So legal recognition of lands and the ability to exclude outsiders has really been at the first line of defense against the virus. Erecting physical barriers on roads and rivers has long been a tactic or a strategy of Indigenous territories resisting outside incursions. And it's really one that's taken on a new life and death meaning in the current context. Whether those barriers are effective at keeping people out depends on how well land rights of Indigenous peoples are respected. And what we've seen in the Amazon basin is that miners, loggers, other extractive industries, as well as narco traffickers and organized crime will go around or through with violence those barriers and enter territories regardless, at a time when government eyes and efforts are turned elsewhere and the rule of law is being barely enforced. It's also interesting to note that Indigenous community mappers and forest monitors, who the Rainforest Foundation and many others have been training and equipping for many years in the context of land rights and territorial defense, have also been playing a key role in the COVID-19 response, manning roadblocks and river checkpoints, acting as the eyes and ears of the community and serving as a communication link back to larger regional and national federations. So really the investments over many years in building the human capacity to advance land rights has really paid off in the context of this pandemic.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's interesting that the networks that are already there are the ones that are being used to try to deal with this crisis now. Next, we're going to hear from Celia. Celia is going to speak in Portuguese, and we're going to have translation after that in English. So if you're not able to understand Portuguese, just hang on, and we'll get to the translation in just a minute. Celia, what do you see as the links between land rights, the coronavirus pandemic, and Indigenous health? Can you tell us a bit more about your work with the Quarentena Indígena?
A pergunta seria: o que você vê como a ligação entre o direito à terra, a pandemia do coronavírus e a saúde indígena? Você poderia nos contar um pouco sobre seu trabalho com a quarentena indígena, por favor?
Olá, eu sou Célia Chacriabá. Agradecer pelo espaço de megafonizar as nossas lutas, porque nós entendemos que, nesse momento, nós, povos indígenas, estamos sendo vitimados não somente pelo Covid-19, mas, sobretudo, com a herança do Covid colonial de 1500. Hoje, no Brasil, já são mais de 29 mil indígenas infectados, quase 30 mil indígenas, 156 povos indígenas atingidos, e já são mais de 700 indígenas vítimas do Covid-19. Nós falamos que, para nós, povos indígenas, não morre, ancestraliza. Mas nós temos um sentimento de que estão ancestralizando prematuramente, nesse genocídio em curso, acelerado, e todo o nosso trabalho tem sido lutar pela vida. Embora muitas vezes nós sentimos frustrados também porque não conseguimos impedir a morte, mas nesse momento a nossa luta faz diferença, porque não é somente sobre quem está morrendo com Covid-19, é quem morreria se nós estivéssemos de braço cruzado. Nós temos um compromisso importante de desacelerar o genocídio, porque 170 anciões indígenas que foram mortos não foram somente os corpos deles que foram enterrados, é um conhecimento da biodiversidade, é um conhecimento do plantar semente, é um conhecimento de observar o tempo, é um conhecimento de saber quando é que vai chover, é um conhecimento de saber de curar os males e a enfermidade dos corpos. 170 anciões que foram embora, não foi somente o corpo enterrado, foi uma memória, foi uma voz, foi um conhecimento, eles sementearam na ciência da terra, mas nós precisamos de nossos ancestrais para continuar cantando aqui na terra com nós. É importante dizer isso, porque a maior campanha do mundo inteiro é pelo Fique em Casa, mas enquanto nós estávamos ficando em casa, nosso direito, nossa morada coletiva está sendo negociada no Congresso Nacional com as PLs de liberação do garimpo, da mineração e do deixar a boiada passar. Nós perguntamos à humanidade, o que vocês vão fazer? Vão deixar a boiada passar por cima de nós? Porque certamente não existe vacina contra o desmatamento, não existe vacina contra as queimadas, não existe vacina contra a violência com os povos indígenas, contra o racismo e contra a necropolítica que nos escolheu para morrer há mais de 520 anos atrás e continua escolhendo porque nós somos alvo número 1. Se não existe vacina para tudo isso, certamente não é somente a vacina que está sendo pesquisada em laboratório que vai curar esse momento de enfermidade do Covid-19, mas, sobretudo, o nosso reativado princípio de humanidade, porque é urgente reativar o princípio de humanidade para curar não somente os pulmões que está localizado no nosso corpo, mas principalmente o pulmão da terra, porque o pulmão do mundo é indígena. As pessoas que não sentem sensibilizado pela dor dos povos indígenas e pelo chamado da terra, nós corremos um risco de morrer pelo mal em comum, que é pelo veneno que chega na nossa mesa. Não existe democracia sem a demarcação dos territórios indígenas. Muito mais do que elaborar 1.000 bilhões de planos emergenciais entre toda a humanidade, a Europa, a América Latina, aqui o Brasil, muito mais do que pensar em planos emergencial, nós precisamos fortalecer nosso plano ancestral e espiritual, porque não é somente sobre imunidade corporal, é sobretudo a imunidade da espiritualidade e da ancestralidade. Nós indígenas, mesmo estando diante de um genocídio, as pessoas perguntam se nós vamos resistir. E nós temos dito que somente quem tem cicatrizes profundas sabe o remédio que cura. Curar, nós precisamos urgente, curar a terra, mas a terra também é cura, porque a terra também é remédio.
Ok. Muito obrigada, Célia. Amanda, can you translate? Amanda, you're on mute. Could you put yourself
Great.
on? Thanks.
Great. Good morning. My name is Amanda Martinez, and I will be making a summary of what Celia Secriaba said. Well, she thanked for the space to be talking about the situation of indigenous peoples in Brazil affected by the COVID-19. She commented that 30,000 people, indigenous people, are infected right now, and 156 people have died. And there are 700 indigenous victims of the COVID. Well, the people who died, they became ancestrals, but this is something that is being premature. We are fighting for life. We feel frustrated because we cannot prevent death. We have an important commitment to combat genocide, and 170 elderly indigenous elders were killed by the virus. It's not just death of physical bodies, because when they die, when an elderly indigenous person dies, Also, the knowledge of biodiversity diets, the knowledge of observing time, the knowledge of how to cure illness, and knowing when it's going to day, when it's going to rain. We buried a memory. We need our ancestors. The biggest campaign worldwide was to stay at home while the government in Brazil is negotiating the territories of indigenous people. She's asking, what will humanity do about this? There is no vaccine against deforestation. There is no vaccine against forest burning. There is no vaccine against racism. There is no vaccine for all this, and certainly there is no vaccine that will cure the spiritual illness of this moment. The indigenous people's principle is in humanity, and so it is urgent to reactivate the principle of humanity to heal the lungs of our bodies, but not only of our bodies, but the lungs of the earth. They say the lung of the world is indigenous. You need to feel the call of Mother Earth. Democracy does not give up without democracy will not occur if the demarcation of indigenous people's territories doesn't actually happen. Much more than thinking about emergency plans, we need to think about spiritual plan. She talks about immunity from spirituality and ancestry. Only those who have deep scars and fight will keep persisting, as indigenous peoples in the global south have been resistant for more than 500 years. And she's saying that earth is also medicine.
Thanks very much, Celia and Amanda. Mina, I want to turn to you now and ask you the same. What do you see as the links between land rights, the coronavirus pandemic, and Indigenous health? And can you tell us a bit more about your work with Aman?
Thank you, Laurie. Before I start, I'd like to honor one of our colleagues from COICA, the coordinator for climate change, Robinson, who passed away a few weeks ago because of the COVID-19. And he's been a great leader and a good friend of us in advocacy works on climate change together. Okay, so in Indonesia, the most threat now for us is for the indigenous peoples. Is, as you know, that we don't really have adequate support from government, for indigenous peoples because of our geographically we are far away from the cities. We don't have adequate health facilities, and also the other threat is because there are so many people flow back to the communities because they feel like the cities has been threatened them. So many people back, and that's threatened the health of the communities. And other things that is important is the national food stock is in crisis. So everywhere now the government is struggling to ensure that we have enough food supply for the next few years. And that's going to affect communities too. And related to the land tenure here, the land rights, we found that in our communities, member of Aman, we have 2,371 member communities in Aman. And mostly, so we found the three categories of people and the communities is under threat. First, the most threatened is the indigenous peoples whose territories has been seized for the companies or conservations or national park, the territories that they cannot access. These communities are in threat because they cannot do farming or agriculture activities. But we also have another indigenous communities who are in critical, indigenous peoples who are forced to become labor or workers in companies or in the urban areas, or oil palm farmers, and they have, or community who failure to harvest due to flood or drought. Now we start to have the drought season now in Indonesia. So these communities are in critical. But there's another category, it's indigenous peoples who are safe from this because they still have their forests, their territory intact, that they still manage sustainably. and they can survive 3 months to few years ahead from now because they have enough food stock. So these are the situation with the land rights. If the community, if the land are protected and the rights are recognized, indigenous peoples can have more, how do you say, they can freely manage their territories. And in pandemic situation like now, they can still do activities like farming activities in their territories. So what we do in Aman in response to COVID-19, since March, before the government announced the situation in Indonesia, we already, our Secretary General sends an instructions to all our members. First is to lock down all the village. Until today, they still do this. So indigenous peoples, they close access to or from their territories. They put signposts, portal, so no one can leave or enter the communities unless there are really urgent matters. And they also do tolak bala rituals. These rituals to prevent misfortune or bad luck. Elders and indigenous peoples believe this new and mysterious disease. Well, you know, there's a trauma from years ago when the Spanish flu happened years ago. It's also affect our communities here. So there's in Indonesia, many members of the community die. So they really take this situation seriously. And other things that we try to do is to do our own production of masks, hand wash, sanitizers, disinfectant independently, because we didn't get support from government, so we have to do it ourselves. And we try to get support from many other peoples who want to support to provide PPA for the community health center. Many smallest community health center in the communities, they don't get support from governments. Meanwhile, they are in dangers because they are not wearing adequate PPA. So we try to provide that also from them the best we can. And we also gather healers in communities, produce herbal medicine to boost community immune system. We think that if we have a strong immune system, we can prevent this. And communities also do this dignified quarantine. So they establish, or they put like a shelter in front of the village. So if any families from the cities have to go back, they have to be quarantined for 14 days there. And of course, we have to make sure the food stock inventory and planting short-term food crops. This also happen everywhere. So now communities are planting more rice, more vegetables. So this become a trend now in our communities. So we have to do this to make sure that we have enough food supply. And with this mechanism, we can support also communities who are in crisis. So the neighbor communities who lost their land already, who cannot do the farming, so this community can support them. So we try to do this reciprocity practices in here. So until now, we established 108 emergency response task force for COVID-19 in various indigenous communities. And I think this important note is until today, there is no report of outside the Aman member communities, at least in our member communities. We don't have any outbreak. There are some infected, but they are outside the community. So we try hard to prevent the outbreak inside the community.
Thanks, Mina. It's really interesting to hear the very practical kind of steps that you're taking that are adding up to that achievement. I'd like to turn to our second question now and go back to Josh. Thanks to their traditional knowledge and their relationship with the natural world, indigenous peoples have long known that the degradation of the environment has the potential to unleash disease. Josh, can you speak more on this from your perspective?
Thanks, Lori. Well, we've in the process of working with the national federations across the Amazon basin and the Amazon Emergency Fund, we've we've heard a lot of stories from many countries and peoples about elders who foresaw a coming crisis, related to the incursion of extractive industries and deforestation and contamination of rivers, and it appears that these stories have really helped communities to believe the public health messages, which was one of the first set of actions that Indigenous federations in the region undertook, was getting out good public health messages about what coronavirus is, and helped them to organize a rapid response, including moving children and elders further into the forest to be safer and protected in isolation. In the pandemic response across the Amazon basin and elsewhere in the region, communities have had to rely more than ever on traditional knowledge to both prevent and cure diseases and promote health and well-being. And given the poor access to Western medicines, communities have had to rely on traditional medicine in responding to COVID-19 specifically, medicines gathered from the forests and from the fields. And there's a growing effort to systematize that medicinal knowledge and to pass it on to younger generations. And as Mina just mentioned, to expand community cultivation of medicinal plants as part of expanded food security efforts. And that's included strategies to build camps in the forest and teach youth how to live off the forest, as well as efforts to establish more formal traditional knowledge, traditional medicine training institutes, botanical gardens, and expand village production of remedies and cures.
That's really interesting. It's a sad reason that changes are happening, but it's interesting to see them. I'll ask you the same questions, Celia. Thanks to their traditional knowledge and their relationship with the natural world, Indigenous peoples have long known that degradation of the environment has the potential to unleash disease. Can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective? And Amanda, could you translate for us?
Sim. Célia, graças aos seus conhecimentos tradicionais e à sua relação com o mundo natural, os povos indígenas há muito tempo sabem que a degradação do meio ambiente tem o potencial de desencadear doenças. Célia, você pode falar mais sobre essa declaração do seu ponto de vista?
É importante dizer isso, Laura, porque, na verdade, nós falamos que nós, povos indígenas, nossos anciões, nosso conhecimento milenar, nós queríamos ser reconhecidos como os maiores doutores, porque nós consideramos que nós somos os maiores doutores pneumologistas, porque nós cuidamos do pulmão do mundo. Mas foi preciso a ciência provar isso para as pessoas realmente entender. Mas há muito tempo nós vemos fazendo essa alerta, porque a cada minuto se corta uma árvore na Amazônia, no nosso bioma cerrado, na Mata Atlântica, na Caatinga, no Pampa, no Pantanal. E a cada vez que se corta uma árvore, corta parte de nosso corpo. A árvore também é corpo, como o corpo também é árvore. Por isso que nós entendemos que o nosso território corpo é uma extensão da Terra. Se a Terra fica doente, é questão de tempo para a gente adoecer também. Porque não é somente a Terra que está sendo adoecida. Os nossos alimentos estão sendo envenenados. A água, os rios também estão sendo envenenados. E a cada minuto que se corta uma árvore, também é o planeta que está condenado a deixar de respirar. Apenas em 2019, foram mais de 1.200.000 hectares de desmatamento no Brasil, nesses 5 biomas: Cerrado, Pantanal, Amazônia, Mata Atlântica, Caatinga. E desse 1 milhão e pouco de desmatamento, na verdade, impacta não somente os territórios indígenas, mas a respiração do mundo. E as pessoas precisam compreender urgentemente que, após enfrentar esse momento de guerra respiratória, mas também é uma guerra humanitária e planetária, vai ter que fazer o enfrentamento do segundo momento, que é o efeito das mudanças climáticas. Mas uma sociedade sem os povos indígenas já vai ter matado o principal princípio ativo, porque nós somos 5% da população do mundo, mas nós protegemos em torno de 82% da biodiversidade do mundo. Nós perguntamos o que a ciência, o que o capitalismo, o que a economia vai fazer o dia que tiver cortado todas as árvores. Porque o dia que tiver cortado todas as árvores, aonde que vai escrever a caneta? Aonde que vai sustentar os pés da humanidade? Aonde que vai sustentar essa cabeça e essa ciência, esse capitalismo que tem nos matado?
Muito obrigada, Célia. Muy interessante. Amanda, can you translate for us? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Yeah, it is important to say this, Laura, because we actually, well, they have been talking about this thing. Indigenous peoples, over ancient knowledge, we wanted to be recognized as doctors because we take care of the largest lung in the world. So we are doctors, but it was necessary that science came to recognize who we actually are and what the role of indigenous peoples plays in this, in medicine, in ancestral medicine too. Every time a tree is cut, a part of our body is cut. The tree, it's part of our own bodies, like the body is part of a tree too. The body is part of nature. We are part of land, of Mother Earth. We are an extension of nature, an extension of land. The land is being poisoned, and every minute a tree is cut, the planet condemns itself to stop breathing. Brazil is being deforested, and so the world is with several regions, with several habitats, and Brazil is being deforested. The breathing of indigenous people is affected with all this deforestation, but also everyone's breath. There is a respiratory war, a humanitarian war. A society without indigenous peoples will actually, how will it be survive? She's saying that 5% of the world's population is indigenous. However, they protect 82% of the biodiversity of the world. How will humanity will sustain itself without this indigenous people's battle against deforestation and against attacks on nature? Where will science and capitalism sustain itself without all this battle of indigenous people protecting land and protecting earth? So, and she keeps on saying that indigenous people should be considered and recognized as doctors without this scientific and academic legitimation.
Thanks, Amanda. Mina, can I turn to you with the same question? That thanks to their traditional knowledge and relationship with the natural world, indigenous people have long known that degradation of the environment is a potential to unleash disease. Tell me how that looks from Indonesia.
Well, actually now is the time for community to collect again their collective memory. First, on lockdown, for example, it is not something new for community. Lockdown is something that they did long before, especially long time before they did that in the tribe war. So they have this practice of lockdown. But several times during the pandemic, they also do this lockdown the village. So now they bring back their collective memory and they agree that we have to do this, and they do it traditionally with rituals as well. And also this time, more and more rituals coming up. I mean, some of the rituals that they didn't practice before, they start to come back because this is really big things that threat indigenous peoples. So rituals and reconnect with the ancestors. And many elders, they were like, we have dreams about the medicines, and so we try to collect all these stories from communities. And sometimes we are frustrated because we want to inform this to authorities, but who gonna believe us that Yeah, like these ingredients and these ingredients can help. And when we think logically that it can cure the heat, for example, and it can cure flu, for example, that can really help. And many elders, the knowledge keepers, now they are really in the central of the knowledge, because people are gathering and asking them, what can we do to boost the immune system or to cure the disease? And many also so this is also time for in the community where elders and the youth coming together. So this is, several years before this pandemic started, we start this movement called Indigenous Youth Homecoming Movement. So now is the really a good time. They go home and practice the knowledge from the elders, and also at the same time they do the farming. They plant and they do farming in the communities. So the traditional knowledge really help communities in time right now. And it can also support governments if governments wants to listen and wants to follow what the indigenous people said. And we think we can really contribute to the science if this knowledge is acknowledged and recognized.
Yeah, it sounds like something scientists would be interested to hear about. I suspect as everyone searches for answers to this, there's probably more interest than normal in this. Thank you. Let's turn to the last question now. Josh, can you talk to us about how Indigenous women's land rights have been particularly affected by the coronavirus pandemic? And do you have examples of how Indigenous women have been at the front lines in the past few months in dealing with this?
Sure, thanks, Lori. As folks might know, women have long been on the forefront of the struggle for land rights in Latin America, and that continues to be true. In the work of the Amazon Emergency Fund, we've really seen a marked uptick in the level of organization of women, particularly as the humanitarian relief efforts around COVID-19 have focused in all countries on the purchase and distribution of food and medicine and taking care of elders and the sick. And the actions currently being led by Indigenous federations across the region, women have played a very active role in these efforts and have really been on the forefront of those efforts, especially at the community level. And importantly, this has led to more vocal demands by women to participate in decision-making around grant priorities for the Amazon Emergency Fund and to ensure that women's organizations at the country level are getting access to the funding that's flowing in. The Amazon Emergency Fund early on established an Indigenous women's seat on our governance group, which is the Emergency Fund's 9-person Indigenous-led governing council. And that governance group has mandated that 30% of all of the funding to the national Indigenous organizations should be directed towards women's organizations via a plan that's developed and approved by them. And just at the meeting this week, it was further approved that to ensure that funding for women's coordinators and communicators in each country to make sure that women's voices are heard and that their demands addressed, both in terms of pandemic response and the broader issues around land rights and Indigenous rights.
That's great to hear that they're backing this up and ensuring women have a real voice in things at this moment. Thanks. Celia, can you talk to us about Indigenous women's land rights? And they've been particularly affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Do you have examples of how Indigenous women have been at the front lines in the past few months there in your area?
Célia, você pode nos falar sobre como os direitos das mulheres indígenas à terra foram particularmente afetados pela pandemia do coronavírus? Além disso, você tem exemplos de como as mulheres indígenas estiveram na linha de frente nos últimos meses?
Nosso direito foi afetado brutalmente porque A primeira pessoa que esse governo também, desde 2018, escolheu para atacar, nós falamos que foi uma mulher. E as pessoas perguntam quem foi essa mulher? Foi a terra. Quando ataca a terra, ataca todo o direito das mulheres indígenas. Porque é nosso útero que sente todo o efeito também, mesmo estando enfrentando o Covid-19, nós não temos tempo ou escolha de ter medo, porque se nós não morrer pelo Covid-19, possivelmente vamos morrer também pelo efeito dos conflitos territoriais, pela mineração, pelo desmatamento e pelas queimadas. As mulheres, nós mulheres estamos na linha de frente também, seja pensando nessa articulação também no combate, nas barreiras sanitárias de monitoramento. No Mato Grosso do Sul, são 70 barreiras sanitárias e as mulheres estão atuando na linha de frente. Aqui no território Chacriabá, são 10 barreiras. Nós, mulheres, também estamos atuando na linha de frente. Nós temos que cuidar da alimentação, nós temos que cuidar das pessoas que ficam doentes, não somente por Covid-19, mas o impacto também cultural, social. E, nesse momento, nós fizemos uma breve reflexão. Em um ano da primeira Marcha das Mulheres Indígenas, nós realizamos uma grande Assembleia das Mulheres Indígenas, porque nós, mulheres indígenas, mesmo estando num momento muito difícil, nós temos transformado a dor, o luto, no desejo de continuar salvando vida. Mas muitas mulheres dentre nós, do movimento indígena brasileiro, perderam companheiros, perderam seus pais, perderam seus filhos prematuramente. Mas tem um índice que aponta que mulheres indígenas estão resistindo muito mais do que seus próprios companheiros. E isso também significa essa imunidade espiritual, essa imunidade da própria resistência, porque para nós não é somente o princípio ativo que cura as enfermidades do corpo, mas, sobretudo, o jeito de cuidar, a relação do cuidar também. Então, é importante compreender que a terra é remédio, por isso que a nossa luta continua sendo pelo território, porque quem tem território tem lugar para onde voltar. Quem tem lugar para onde voltar tem colo e tem cura. Agora, no dia 5, Dia Internacional das Mulheres Indígenas, nós estamos reunindo mulheres indígenas do mundo inteiro nessa rede, nesse encontro global, porque nós precisamos curar não só o pulmão, não só o útero, mas também a terra e toda a humanidade.
Muito obrigada. Amanda, can you give us a summary of that? Sure, it's a lot to catch up on. Can you turn there?
Okay. Thank you very much. She says, our right was brutally affected because the first person this government chose to attack was a woman. And who was this woman? It was the land. It was Earth, Mother Earth. When you attack the land, attacks all the land rights of indigenous women, or uterus is feeling all that is happening this time. If we don't die from COVID-19, we will die from the conflicts, from the territorial conflict, from the deforestation, from the fire process in the forest. We keep thinking and creating ideas in this battle against COVID-19. We are monitoring barriers. We are in the sanitary barriers. In the Chacriabá territory, there are 10 barriers. We have to take care of food and we have to take care of people who are sick. We made a great assembly of indigenous women, and we transform pain and mourning into desire to continue saving lives. But many of us lost partners, parents, children prematurely. People are resisting more than their own, women actually are resisting more than indigenous men. We have a spiritual immunity. For us, what cures illness is also a way of caring. The cure, the spiritual immunity that they have is the way to know how to care for others. The earth is medicine. Our fight is for the territory, because if you have territory, there is a place to return. There is a place where you can have a mother's lab. We are bringing together Indigenous women from all over the world because we need to heal the lungs, we need to heal the uterus, we need to heal the earth and all of humanity. Okay.
Thanks very much. Mina, can you talk to us about how Indigenous women's land rights have been particularly affected by the coronavirus pandemic? And do you have any examples of how Indigenous women have been at the front lines in the past few months?
Yeah, Laurie, in many of, or not most, maybe in most of the communities, actually the knowledge keeper are mostly women. So the women elders, they are the knowledge keeper, and usually they have specific knowledge that is really important in situation like this. Not only about medicine plant or herbal plants, but they also have the knowledge keeper of the food, the seed. And they are not only the knowledge keeper, but they are the keeper of the seed as well. And it is really important in the situation like this. Their role in the situation like this is really important, more than before. And in our experience, they are trying to pass the knowledge now to the younger generations. And in situation like this, everybody think that it is really important to do that. It's more than the normal situation, no? So they are really critical. They have really critical roles. And not only as a knowledge keeper, in our emergency response team, most of in the front line who work harder is the women and youth. Sorry for the men, but well, they work together, but women and youth, they're really, I don't know how to explain it, but they really have this passion in working on this because they want to protect their family. So women and youth, they work hard to produce the face masks and the hand sanitizers. They use local ingredients for hand sanitizers. So we didn't use the chemical ones because all the elders who knows the medicines knowledge, the herbal medicines, they come out with their knowledge, and the community produce this and share it with others. And this has been the practice for a few months. And also they are in the front line in planting, in farming, together with the youth. So yeah, the role of Indigenous women are really important. Although they have to work more now, no, in the situation, in the COVID situations. Meanwhile, the land rights of Indigenous women, we cannot separate them with the men, with the whole communities. It's always attached with the community situations. And in Indonesia, the land rights of the indigenous communities are not yet recognized. We are still fighting for the recognition of our rights through what we call the Undang-Undang Masyarakat Adat, or the Indigenous Peoples Rights Bill. That is, we are still working on that now. And yeah, in other things is the criminalization and evictions of Indigenous peoples from their land still happen. Just on the 18th August last time, so many women and children, they have to be evicted from their territories because the companies coming into their territories. So it still happened. I mean, even during the pandemic. So that is something that we make a call to the governments to at least stop this encroachment of indigenous territories. This is a pandemic time. They don't make the situation heavier than usual. But it still happened, and we're still struggling to protect the communities from this threat.
Yeah, it really does seem like a time when a moratorium on those kind of intrusions would be called for, doesn't it? Thank you, I appreciate that. We're gonna turn now to some questions after that really interesting discussion that brought up a lot to talk about. We've got all kinds of questions coming in. I would remind you, if you're listening and you have a question and haven't posed it yet, please go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to add your question in. And luckily, we've got about 40 minutes to get through them, so hopefully we'll be able to address quite a lot of them. I'm going to start with this one. This is a question for all the panelists that's come in from listeners. To the degree that corporations and companies have impeded on the lands of Indigenous communities, what efforts are being made to address this issue with shareholders and consumers for things like ESG rules and focusing on the SDGs? Are you seeing any of that? Mina, would you like to take that one first?
Well, I don't really have knowledge on whether there's a real response yet from the companies, from business entities, to how they're going to change the business in the future. There are some rumors that they are struggling now to find the solution for this. But I want to make a call for anyone who can, who have initiative on how companies can change the habit. You have to find the innovation now, because this is the critical situations when we as Indigenous peoples, while we are trying to protect our territories, we are also have to brace for impact for post COVID-19, because the global economic is collapsing. We are thinking that, oh my God, maybe in the near future, all the governments and the business, they will rush to do whatever to raise the economic situation again. And it will means that our territories will be again under threat, because they will look how to exploit as much they can, because they have to return the economic back to normal. So if anyone have any innovations for the technology innovations or things that can be that can inspire the business to change their business, you have to do it now and soon as possible, before the pandemic gone or pass, because now is the time. Otherwise, we are actually scared about what will happen post pandemic to our territories.
Celia, I'm interested in the same thing from you, whether you're seeing that there are efforts now to address the problems created in Indigenous land by pressure from shareholders or consumers, using the SDGs or ESG guidelines, or like Mina, do you see that there's just a much bigger threat rather than a lot being done? Amanda, could you translate the question for Celia?
Sim. Célia, estou querendo saber em que medida as corporações e empresas têm impedido nas terras de comunidades indígenas, e que esforços têm sido feitos para abordar essa questão da presença das corporações e empresas, incluindo assim, questões ambientais e sociais do governo, que tem sido feito para evitar a presença dessas corporações no território de vocês?
Na verdade, nós estamos vivenciando um momento de abertura de todas essas fronteiras, e por isso que hoje, quando nós falamos de genocídio e tenta calar a nossa voz, eu falo, não, desculpa, eu errei. É um genocídio legislado, é um ecocídio legislado, é um etnocídio legislado, a matança da nossa identidade sendo autorizada pelo Estado brasileiro. Porque quando o governo diz que vai deixar a boiada passar, flexibilizando todas essas leis que garantem exatamente a proteção nos territórios indígenas, nós estamos autorizando também a matar os povos indígenas. E foi pensando nisso que nós estamos muito mais mobilizados, enquanto movimento indígena, nessa autonomia, porque se não é o direito que vai garantir aos nossos territórios a nossa existência é com muita luta que nós vamos conseguir garantir o direito. E no Brasil, quando as leis, quando a sociedade cala, o genocídio, o racismo, o desmatamento e as queimadas falam no nosso território. As balas falam nos corpos das lideranças indígenas. Ano passado, foram 130 lideranças indígenas assassinadas por conflitos territoriais. E foi em meio também, quando nós lançamos a jornada Sangue Indígena, Nenhuma Gota a Mais, nós percorremos 12 países na Europa, 20 cidades, em 35 dias. E a nossa principal mensagem é que para o genocídio indígena, porque baseado no relatório da Articulação dos Povos Indígenas do Brasil, nós identificamos o rastreamento da soja que é exportada para a Alemanha, da soja que é exportada para toda a Europa, e ela vem de áreas de conflitos indígenas. Então, quando aumenta o consumo, aumenta também a demanda do desmatamento criminoso. E quando exporta produtos de commodities do Brasil, não estão exportando somente grãos, estão exportando as nossas vidas. Nós precisamos repensar essa noção do consumo. Alimentar não deve ser sinônimo de matar os povos indígenas.
Obrigada, Célia. Amanda, can you put on your sound and translate that for us? It looks like you're still on mute.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. Celia was talking about that there is a legislated genocide, a legislated ethnocide, and the killing of indigenous people that is being done by the Brazilian state. The laws that protect indigenous territories are actually being stopped by the Brazilian state because the new laws are authorizing the killing of indigenous peoples. So indigenous people are being more mobilized because it is not the law that will be actually guaranteeing indigenous people existence. So they are struggling with the right itself. In Brazil, when society does not speak for indigenous people, the deforestation is speaking of what is going on to these human societies. The bullets and the dead of leaders will speak when Brazilian society stays quiet against this genocide. She's saying that last year, 130 indigenous leaders were killed. So it was created the campaign Indigenous Blood to stop indigenous blood, stop indigenous genocide. It was the campaign, not a single drop of indigenous blood anymore. She said, our message is to stop the indigenous genocide. We identify the tracking of soy that is taken from Brazil to Germany and is actually being planted in indigenous lands and indigenous territories. So when they export commodity products from Brazil to other countries, from Brazil to other, to Europe, they are also exporting our lives. So alimentation, well, food security should not be synonymous of killing indigenous people, because that is what is representing for them.
Thanks. Josh, do you see anything interesting in that area about efforts being made through shareholders or pressure on by consumers or through them to deal with this problem?
Thanks, Laurie. I mean, it's not an area that I've worked on a whole lot, but I'm sure many of the panelists and participants are aware of the efforts around voluntary standards, around carbon disclosure, deforestation-free supply chains, and public procurement. All of which many different groups have been working on over the last 5-10 years. Some progress there, but we don't necessarily see a lot of changes on the ground in terms of corporate behavior. My understanding is that one of the new waves of organizing, certainly around the Amazon now, is targeting banks and investors. pension funds, others who are investing in the deforestation commodities, whether that's timber or soy or beef. So that I think is a new front that we'll see whether that can be successful and whether consumers can have an impact on banks and pension funds, public and private pension funds. You know, and the other, just to echo some of what Mina and Celia said, you know, across the Amazon, we're seeing kind of in response to the economic crisis that's been part of you know, the whole COVID pandemic, is the rollback of environmental regulations and governments really taking a step back from enforcing environmental regulations in the name of economic reactivation. And so that's going to be really something to watch and to work on as we go forward, because the policy environment may well get decidedly worse.
Thanks, Josh. I wanted to turn to a question we've got here that touches on a little bit of what Mina was talking about technology. She was asking if there's any technology out there that is helpful in dealing with any of these problems. And someone's asked, to what degree, if any, has technology been incorporated in processes, you know, to try to look at these things, particularly mobile technology, such as social media, APPs, focused data collection and video? Have you seen any successes or challenges, any of you, in using this to try to address the problems you're seeing? I'll open it up to just raise your hand. I'll call on you. Have any of you seen? Yeah, Mina, go ahead.
Well, you know, in Aman, we have this, we call Aman apps. Basically, we create this before pandemic to collect data from communities. But during pandemic, we make some changes so we can collect data also from communities on COVID-19. And it's worked so far. Not really easy to collect data directly from communities because not everyone aware on technologies. And not only because of that, but also because many communities doesn't have internet access. So they are not connected with the world. So sometimes that is the challenge, and when we want to collect data from communities. So sometimes we have to do it manually, and then we input it in ourselves. So it's I think in the future it's really important to ensure that the modern technology can also be accessed by the communities, or the combinations. This is what we think it's best. Combination of traditional knowledge and the modern technology. If we can find anyone who can support us on creating or inventing a technology that can combine this knowledge together, that will be really, really helpful. And also help indigenous peoples on how to connect each other, because during this pandemic, especially in lockdown time, if there is no signal, there's no internet in the communities, they really, really out of the world. They're alone. Although they can still do their activities normally inside the communities, there's no problem. But it's just important for us to collect data from them and for them to connect with the world so they can really know what's going on. I spoke to some of the community members and they were like, there's no COVID. It's not happening. People really die because of COVID. Here is fine. Yeah, because they don't feel any effect in the community level and information is not getting to them. I told them millions of people already die. You have to know this. And so, you know, it is important to share information also to the communities. Government always update informations, but whether the information reach the communities or not, we cannot sure how communities knows. So many communities, sometimes they don't believe COVID is happening because they are safe in their own village.
Yeah, so you really need to be using this information two ways.
Yeah.
Josh, you were nodding your head a lot. Tell me about what's happening that you're seeing.
Well, I guess, I mean, to echo Mina, in the Amazon, we've certainly seen that the government public health information is not reaching communities effectively. So really the first set of responses in March and April and into May was taking simplified public health information about what's COVID-19 and hand washing and social distancing and that kind of very basic stuff, translating those messages into Indigenous languages and using social media, using WhatsApp, Facebook, whatever, to get those messages out to communities, using community radio as well. And that's been really effective. So that's been a way that social media has really contributed to disseminating public health information that I think has been helpful. The other thing that I alluded to earlier is that what at the Rainforest Foundation, and I think more broadly, because we've been working with community forest monitors for many years. So those are tend to be Indigenous youth in their communities who are equipped with smartphones, cell phones that can take georeferenced points and pictures and videos. And so those people have really turned into the eyes and the ears of the communities and have been a link to be able to get information in and information out. And you know, we had already set up and across many territories, Indigenous community forest monitors had systems for getting information in and out, even when there's poor access to internet. So that's also, I think, been really helpful, and a number of Indigenous communities federations have worked on gathering information on the spread of COVID at the village level and sharing that information with public health authorities and with everyone. And so we've set up a number of kind of spatial data hubs that are gathering that information and are using that as a way to kind of coordinate aid response. And I've also, I mean, this issue of access to internet, access to communications has become more and more critical in the face of this pandemic. And I think we are seeing some innovations around that. We met just this week with a group that was working on that had technology that could turn high frequency radio, which many communities have, into essentially a kind of wireless router so that you could send text, you could send photos, you could send files across radio waves, which is something that I'd never heard of before, but that we'll try to be adapting and expanding the use of.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask Celia another question that's come up in the pile of questions here, and Amanda, maybe you can help me translate. They're asking about experiences the panelists may have had of diseases being transmitted from animals to people. You know, COVID-19 has made this news, but that transmission may be more common than we think. We're just curious to hear any discussion of the community experience in seeing this happen. Amanda, could you ask Celia if she's seen that or her communities have seen that problem before?
Cília, estão querendo saber que experiências tem tido, assim, seja tua comunidade, Cuiabá ou comunidades indígenas no Brasil, se tem experiência nesse tipo de doenças transmitidas por animais, se isso é uma coisa comum, como essa experiência da pandemia de COVID-19, se isso já tinha acontecido no passado, não necessariamente sendo uma pandemia, mas esse processo de transmissão de uma doença de animais para pessoas.
A experiência que nós, povos indígenas, temos diante desse ataque biológico, na verdade, foi desde a invasão do Brasil. Por isso que nossas lideranças, algumas estão morrendo pelo Covid, mas algumas, assim como a companheira do cacique Raoni, morreram por medo, só de medo de pegar essa doença, porque essa cicatriz do processo de colonização também nos dá medo. E por isso que nós falamos que para a sociedade brasileira, para o mundo, pode não significar o extermínio na totalidade da população, mas para nós, povos indígenas, nós éramos 5 milhões de indígenas no Brasil, e hoje nós não chegamos a 1% da população brasileira. Nós não chegamos a 900 mil indígenas na população brasileira, que foi vítima desse extermínio, dessa guerra biológica também, porque no processo de colonização usavam roupas contaminadas para chegar até os territórios indígenas, roupas contaminadas de sarampo. E na época dessa guerra do sarampo, por exemplo, só da minha família, eu perdi 3 pessoas. Foi um irmão do meu pai, um primo meu, um tio meu, e logo depois veio outra guerra também de contaminação, que foi a meningite. Então, nós, povos indígenas, sabemos o que é ser exterminado na totalidade. O povo Juma, na região norte do Brasil, só restam 23 pessoas, e eles não podem mais ter filhos. Então, a gente assistiu o extermínio de um povo e não poder fazer mais nada, porque essa guerra biológica, ela mata os povos indígenas na sua totalidade. No Mato Grosso do Sul, agora, nesse momento, é onde o índice da letalidade está mais alto. E para nós é muito grave, porque morrer mais de 700 indígenas, nós estamos correndo o risco de ser extinto mais uma vez por essa guerra biológica, mas que não é somente biológica, é humanitária e planetária mais uma vez.
Obrigada, Célia. Amanda, can you translate that for us?
Okay. Well, the experience we have faced, it's the biological attack that has occurred since the invasion of Brazil and the Americas. Some people die from COVID-19 today, but others also die by fear. There is a huge fear of what people had felt from the colonization process that was also created by disease. For the Brazilian society and the world society, this might not mean an extermination, but for indigenous people, it is, because before the colonial invasions, the population was enormous. This was a biological war because in the process of decolonization, they used contaminated clothes. In the war, at the time of the measles war, she lost a lot of family members, and she also remembers the meningitis, where many people died. She's recalling that the Juma people, today there is only 3 people left from the Juma people, from the Juma community. So they're seeing and experimenting all this extermination, this biological war, and they cannot do anything. She's also recalling that in Mato Grosso do Sul, the index of people contaminated by COVID-19, it's high. So they are, again, running the risk of losing a lot of people, of disappearing as indigenous peoples in our society. So this is not new. This is something that it has always been experienced since the colony. And this memory, it's still alive, and it's creating great fear again and again.
Okay. Mina or Josh, did you have anything to say about that, or shall I move on to the next one? Okay, I'm going to go on. In what way, if any, have external efforts to invest in tenure security, both by governments and donors, been affected by the COVID-19 crisis? Have you seen any changes to efforts because of this pandemic period? Does anybody have any experience with that? Would like to answer that one? And Amanda, could you translate that for Celia as well. Basically looking at whether efforts to improve tenure security have been hit by the pandemic, either efforts by government or. Josh, you want to start?
I don't know more broadly across the Latin America region, but certainly in our work at Rainforest Foundation, where we do focus a lot on supporting land titling efforts. All of those efforts have stopped as a result of the pandemic. Most work at titling requires outsiders coming into communities to verify maps and to walk boundaries, and those kinds of activities would no longer be safe. Governments have also shut down and have been slow to restart, especially in our own experience. Those agencies which deal with Indigenous land titling have not been at the number one priority for governments to restart. So I think there's been a big slowdown, and it's unclear how quickly things will start back up.
Okay. Mina, do you want to say something about that?
Well, yeah, unfortunately for Indonesia, we are having a setback of securing tenure rights because now government is planning to invite more investors. There's a new law, draft law, omnibus law on job creations that is now pro-cons in Indonesia, and it's huge things. And this draft law is being discussed, and seems like our parliament is going to rush to how do you say? To make it official, to make it become a law. And if this become law, it will be really, really dangerous for us, because it actually gives all the major rights for the investors to use land in Indonesia, and that will threaten our territories. And because of, in the name of creating jobs, but it's not recognized the traditional job of Indigenous peoples, like the farmers, the fisheries, they are also under threat. So also this, because they try to combine all the laws together into one law, it will also affect our Indigenous schools, because everything have to be formalized from the national governments. So we are actually really worried that in the next few years, we will have more problems in securing tenure rights rather than easier after pandemic. Yeah. So because of the threat of the economy, because of this new law, so we are really sad actually, and really trying to fight together with we create coalitions together with civil society groups on how to prevent the omnibus law from being how do you say that? I don't know the law term in English. Yeah, to make it officially law.
Right.
Yeah, that is situation in Indonesia, and yeah, that needs a lot of. It will give us more work for the futures in how to secure the land rights of Indigenous peoples.
Thanks. Given our time is now running short, we probably got time to get through one more question. I wanted to ask this one to Celia, or does she have something to say on this last question, Amanda? Would you like to ask her this one about the threats to land tenure?
Célia, te queriam fazer outra pergunta, mas também estão perguntando se gostaria de te preferir responder essa pergunta de que forma a mudança, assim, se tem existido mudanças ou esforços para melhorar a segurança de posse de terra, a segurança da posse dos seus territórios durante a pandemia. Aí você prefere responder essa pergunta ou a gente vai para uma pergunta que Laurie queria realizar?
posso responder rapidinho.
Pronto.
É importante, na verdade, não existiu. Quando as pessoas perguntam qual é o plano do governo para nós, povos indígenas, nós já sabíamos que era o plano genocida, porque desde o início eles nos têm como inimigo número 1, e nós somos o inimigo número 1 que não faz questão de abrir mão, porque o plano que ele tem para o Brasil é um plano anti-adversidade, anti-humanitário, anti-indígena e anti-a-vida. Então, nesse momento, o que tem sustentado a nossa existência tem sido a autonomia e a luta dos povos indígenas. Porque existe estrutura de poder, o poder executivo, legislativo e judiciário, mas nós acreditamos na luta como um quarto poder.
Samantha, can you translate that?
Sorry. Well, she says that that didn't exist, that what is the government plan? Well, they always knew that the government plan was a genocidal plan because they see Indigenous peoples as their enemy number 1 because they are not going to give up on their territory. So the government's plan is anti-Indigenous, is anti-diversity. So even though there are laws, they prefer to do an autonomy organization to struggle and to fight for Indigenous people's rights. There is a power structure, but they believe in fighting as, they believe that fighting and persisting is the 4th power.
Okay, thanks. I think our last question, I would probably have to hold answers fairly short to this one to get to everyone, but it's an interesting question. I think we should try to get through it. Despite tons of science-based evidence suggesting that COVID-19 came about as a consequence of habitat destruction and fragmentation because of agricultural expansion in part, current narratives seem to focus on industrialized solutions such as vaccines, but there's little said about the need to make a transition to a more sustainable way to go about food production. Would it make sense to bring about a strong statement based on Indigenous knowledge as a reminder of the need to alter our rationale for interacting with nature? Do you think this is a good time to try to make that point that we ought to be shifting food systems, not just looking for vaccines? Who'd like to start with that one? Amanda, maybe you can translate that for Celia.
Célia, aqui a pergunta seria, apesar de toneladas de evidência científica sugerindo que o COVID-19 surgiu como uma consequência da destruição e da fragmentação do hábitat na questão da expansão agrícola, as narrativas atuais parecem se concentrar em soluções industrializadas, como vacinas, mas pouco é dito sobre a necessidade de fazer uma transição para uma forma mais sustentável de produzir alimentos. Faria sentido fazer uma declaração forte baseada no conhecimento indígena como um lembrete universal da necessidade de alterar nossa lógica para interagir com a natureza? Então, pedindo que a resposta seja curta, porque o tempo está meio corrido, mas essa seria a pergunta.
É exatamente nesse impasse que nós vivemos, porque nesse momento nós falamos que as pessoas precisam compreender que o princípio ativo não está concentrado somente nas vacinas que estão sendo pesquisadas no laboratório, porque essa vacina ela não vai fazer enxergar essa cegueira monocular social também, essa dormência social também. Então, é urgente repensar os modos de vida indígenas como um caminho, como uma possibilidade da cura. Ano passado, nós pressionamos ainda para barrar o acordo do Mercosul. E agora, Greta, por exemplo, está ecoando junto com as vozes dos povos indígenas. Não há mais tempo se nós não retomar nosso tempo. As pessoas estão numa constante luta contra o tempo. Mas eu falo que combater o Covid-19, combater as mudanças climáticas, o aceleramento das indústrias, não é exatamente uma luta contra o tempo, é sobretudo uma luta pela retomada do nosso tempo. Só tem autonomia quem tem a retomada do tempo, só tem autonomia quem tem a liberdade da voz e dos territórios.
Obrigada, Célia. Can you quickly translate that, Amanda?
Okay, she says exactly this is the situation that we live. At the moment we speak, people need to understand that the solution is not necessarily a vaccine. This will not make us see the social crisis that we are living. So it is urgent to rethink indigenous ways of life and how and the possibility of a cure, because it's not necessarily concentrated in a vaccine or in industrial solutions. She said that they were pressing to collate the Mercosur agreement, and there is no more time if we not appropriate of our time. Fighting the COVID-19, the industry is not fighting against time, but actually fighting to gain the time we lost. And she believes that gaining that time, recuperating that time, it's the way to be autonomous and free.
Thanks very much. Mina or Josh, we've got about 2 minutes left. If either of you has got something on this, Mina, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think, of course, it's still important to find a vaccine. We have to remember that there are millions of people in the world affected by this, and they need the vaccine as soon as possible. But it doesn't mean that we cannot work on other things as well. There are people who are working on finding the vaccines and produce it, but the resilience of communities is, we think it's really important, because if the communities, whether it's indigenous communities, local communities, or communities in the cities, if everyone can make sure that the community's resilience is there, that will really helpful in situation like this. And it can also bring back the economy if the community resilience is ensured. I think that's the important thing.
Okay, thanks very much. Josh, did you have a last word?
Sure. Well, I think that question is leading us in the right direction. There is an urgent need to transform our world food systems, and I think that the pandemic has really laid that bare. And I think it's not just food systems. It's the other drivers of deforestation, of habitat destruction, including mining, extractive industries, all of those things. We've seen in much sharper relief the need to change the way we live on the planet.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate all of your time, the panelists and those of you who've listened to this really interesting discussion today. You're going to see popping up on your screen a brief survey that we'd like you to fill out if possible about just how you found this today and whether it was useful and so on. It only takes about 2 minutes to fill it out. You'll also get an email if you've signed up with a copy of this probably tomorrow, and another chance to fill out the survey if you don't have time to do it right now, but it should be coming up for you. I would also, if you found this one interesting, there are a couple of my colleagues and some other colleagues here from Indigenous communities are going to be on another couple of these discussions talking about how COVID-19 is affecting Indigenous communities, including one on this issue of regulatory rollback that Josh was talking about. Those are coming up on the 10th and the 17th of September, if you want to mark your calendars. And you'll see, I'm sure, some communication coming out about that. So just to wrap up, thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful to all of you for some fascinating insights about this. And to Amanda as well for her on-the-spot translation that made it possible for us to get Celia's remarks into this, which is always incredibly valuable. I hope you'll fill out the survey and tune in for the future events that are coming up. And thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.